too. But I don't think we've reached the heart of it even yet. I think the real reason he wrote was internal to the church. Not the state of the city of Rome, but the state of the church. And we know enough about the history of the church in Rome to know exactly what that problem was. There was a crisis, there was a problem. And this is what it was and how it arose. Now, we don't know who founded the church in Rome. I haven't a clue, I can't tell you. I do know that there were people from Rome in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. It says, visitors from Rome. And I've no doubt that some of them were converted that day among the 3,000 baptisms. And they must have been the first to carry back the gospel back to their home in Rome. Because there was a colony, a ghetto, unfortunately, a ghetto of 40,000 Jews in Rome at that time. Already there were scattered Jews all around the Mediterranean, 40,000 of them in the city. And no doubt the first Roman church was Jewish and began in that ghetto with Hebrew believers in Jesus, filled with the Holy Spirit. And so for the first chapter in its life, the church was entirely Jewish, and it grew. And no doubt was fostered by evangelism among Jewish merchants and traders, always coming in and out of the city. Now then came an emperor called Claudius. Claudius. You've seen the play on television? Jacobi? Derek Jacobi played the part of Claudius. Well, now Claudius was anti-Jewish. And he watched them to find an excuse to throw them out of Rome. And he says there was a disturbance among the Jews over a person called Chrestus. Chrestus. And that could easily be Christus. But he didn't quite get it right. I think it was. And there was a riot in the Jewish ghetto between the Chrestus followers and the Jews. Now that's what happened everywhere Paul went. The Jews were the real enemies of the gospel. And therefore in Rome, now in the Jewish ghetto, there's a riot about the followers of Christus. And Claudius says, out! All of you Jews out! You can't live in peace among yourselves. I won't have you in Rome. And 40,000 Jews had to leave Rome in the year AD, what? I can't even remember. And I haven't got it down, so I can't tell you. You'll have to work it out for yourselves. And the Jews were expelled. Among them was a Jewish couple called Aquila and Priscilla. That name strike a chord? And in Acts chapter 18, it says that Paul met up with Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth because they'd been turned out of Rome by Claudius. So it all hangs together. But by this time, the Christian church in Rome had a few Gentile members. And suddenly the church in Rome shrank from a large Jewish church to a small Gentile one. But then it grew. And those few Gentiles evangelized Gentiles. So that now we had, instead of an almost entirely Jewish church in Rome, an almost entirely Gentile church. And then Claudius died. And the next emperor said, you Jews can all come back, you're good for business. Which is true. And he wasn't the last ruler to invite Jews in to help the financial situation. And all the Jews came flooding back, including the Jewish believers. But now the Gentiles were running the church. Now, do you begin to sense the crisis? The Jewish believers have come back, and lo and behold, they're not very welcome. And the Gentile believers are in charge. It's happened before and it's happened since, and I'm afraid it'll go on happening. And people have to leave and they come back and try and integrate again. It's not easy to reintegrate into a fellowship, is it? Maybe some of you know that. Well, that was the problem. And now there was tension between the Jewish and Gentile believers inside the church. Now I believe we've got to the key that opens Romans for you. Everything Paul says is to get those two groups back into one fellowship. And when you look through the letter, you find that almost every part of it is dealing with that situation. He talks about sin first, and he talks about the sin in the city of Rome. And then he says, now you. And he says, Gentiles are sinners, Jews are sinners. Let's begin right there. You're all equal sinners before God. Jews are no better than Gentiles, Gentiles no better than Jews. You're all sinners. And then he moves on to justification, how we get right with God. And he says, we're all justified by faith, whether we're Jews or Gentiles. And as he goes through the letter, he's always saying, Jews and Gentiles are the same. We're sinners the same, we need to be saved the same way. We're heading for the same heaven, we're saved by the same blood. Why are you arguing as to who's the more important, who was first here, who's more important than the other in God's sight? Then in chapters 6 and 7, he deals with the two peculiar problems that Gentiles have with the gospel and that Jews have with the gospel. And we have our old friends, legalism and license. And Gentiles were prone to go into license, and Jews were prone to go into legalism. So in chapter 6, he deals with license and tells them, don't you realize when you were baptized, you're finished with sin, it has no more dominion over you. But in chapter 7, he deals with legalism, and he talks about his own past. He said, I tried to keep the law, but I couldn't keep the 10th law on coveting. And he said, you can't keep the law. So he's dealing with the license of the Gentiles and the legalism of the Jews. And then he says in chapter 8, now I'm going to talk about the liberty of the Spirit. And we've got Galatians again in those 3 chapters. But he's dealing with Jew and Gentile. And he's saying you've both got problems. You're both sinners, you're both justified by faith, and you've both got problems with the gospel. You Gentiles are going into license, shall we sin that grace may abound? You Jews are going back into legalism. And he said, you may serve the law of God with your mind, but you'll find another law within your members that serves the law of sin. And you finish up by saying, the good I want to do, I can't do. And the evil I don't want to do, I do. That's where legalism leaves you. In utter frustration and despair, wretched man that I am, what we need is the liberty of the Spirit that unites Jew and Gentile. Then he comes to chapters 9 to 11, which are so crucial to the whole letter. You see, Gentiles are prone to think like this, and we still do, and the majority of churches in this country think like this. We are the new Israel. We have replaced the Jewish people. They're out of God's purposes. We're in. And the whole of chapters 9 to 11 are to deal with that tension between Jew and Gentile. It is still having to be dealt with today. 9 to 11 must still be preached today because the churches of this country are into what is known as replacement theology, which is that God has washed his hands of the Jewish people and the church is now Israel. That is not true. The name Israel is never given to the church in the New Testament. And Paul has to say, do you think God is finished with the Jews? Just because they rejected him, do you think he rejected them? Never. And that whole section becomes the key to the book and the key to the relationships between Gentile and Jew. And he says this, we're up against this old question that I've raised earlier. He says, now you Gentiles, don't be proud because the Jews were cut off and you were grafted in. You too will be cut out if you do not continue in God's kindness. Strong word. Christians, you too will be cut off unless you continue in God's kindness. So don't boast over the Jews. And he says, I'll tell you a big secret. One day all Israel will be saved. They're going to be brought right back in. And Jew and Gentile will be one olive tree for God. Now, do you see how those chapters become the key to open up the whole thing? It's all about their internal problem of the Jewish church having been banished, the Gentiles coming back in, and now these two groups can't get on with each other. They're each saying, we're better than you. The Jews are saying, we were the first, And the Gentiles are saying, oh, but you've been cut off and we've replaced you. And Paul says, no, no, no.